I'd like to introduce our last panel for the afternoon, and they're going to be covering future risk in the industry. And Jeff Walker, Senior Vice President and Chief Risk Officer at ACES, is going to be our moderator. And Jeff leads ACES Energy Risk Services in the middle office, including trading control, credit, contract administration, regulatory, and corporate development. Jeff has also led the design and development of the energy risk management capabilities to address the risk challenges facing ACES members and customers. He has over 30 years of experience in the energy markets and has led ACES Middle Office since its inception in 1999. Our panelists include Mike McFarland from Great River Energy, Paul Hughes from Southern Company, and Greg Starheim from CFC. So please welcome our panel.
Good afternoon. In our last hour, we're going to talk about the top risks looking forward for electric utilities. And with me is our distinguished panel of guests. I want to cover their backgrounds a little bit before we move on. To the left, as you face the stage, Greg Starheim is the Senior Vice President of Business and Industry Development at CFC. Greg has been involved in the electric utility industry for 35 years, including 18 with the Electric Cooperative Program, where Greg was a CEO and general manager of Delaware County Electric Cooperative, and then president and CEO of Kenergy Corporation in Kentucky. In his first 19 years of his industry career, Greg served across GE's power generation businesses, including technical director of GE's corporate research and development. Greg currently leads CFC's efforts focused on strategic and emerging issues facing our industry, including the evolving trends of regulations, technology, and the market. In the center, Mike McFarland is the Director of Enterprise Risk Management at Great River Energy, G&T, with 30 years of experience in the utility industry. Before GRE, Mike operated a consulting company, was president of an IT security services company, held senior positions in telecommunications, and began his career at Northern State Power for 13 years as a professional and a leader. Mike is recognized as an enterprise risk management leader among his G&T peers and currently oversees GRE's energy risk management, internal audit, and insurance programs. And on the right, Paul Hughes is the generation policy manager at Southern Company Services, and very recently served as Southern's manager of risk control, where his responsibilities included credit management, deal valuation, operational systems, and various regulatory matters. Paul has 20-plus years of experience, primarily in the energy trading sector, and once managed the financial hedging programs for all of Southern Company's operating companies. Currently, Paul is responsible for both internal and external policy issues at Southern Company, being primarily focused on wholesale markets and generation activities. For a little context, I want to start off with a discussion of indicating that many risks in our industry are often driven by changes and uncertainties. And change has become much more dynamic and fast-moving and may even risk affecting the traditional business model of a G&T. The pace of unprecedented changes in the electric utility industry in the last 5 years rivals what we've seen in the preceding 50 years. So first and foremost, clean energy legislation and pressures come from some states and also from various stakeholders. The industry structure has become much more decentralized due to distributed generation, storage, combined storage and renewables, as well as accelerating interruptible loads. More clean energy means more variable energy resources that perform or not perform on the basis of weather patterns. This morning we heard about technology innovations, and with power flowing in both directions now, there's an evolving need for a smarter grid with two-way communications. Unprecedented cybersecurity challenges have now emerged throughout our industry and for natural gas pipelines as well. So since we find ourselves in this brave new world of many changes, The panel is going to address the top risk on the horizon looking forward. But for context, before we start the Q&A, I've asked each panelist to tell us a little bit about their organization, their markets, and how they manage risk at their organization. So I'm going to start that with Mike, next Paul, and then Greg.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Jeff and ACES, for the invitation and the opportunity to speak, and for the great conference. Just a few quick words on Great River Energy. We're a 28-member, mostly Minnesota rural electric cooperative. We've got plants in Minnesota and in North Dakota. We're at about $1 billion in revenue, just under 800 employees. You see some other statistics there. We're a member of the MISO market. Great River Energy was formed by Cooperative Power and United Power Associates merger in 1999. This is just a really busy but quick overview of our risk management program. Our risk management program was formalized in 2007. At that time, we were taking energy trading in-house. That was 2 years before we joined ACES. At the same time, we were also exiting our U.S. and moving to the capital markets, and so a formalized risk program was called for. What you see here is just an example of monthly risk reports that we put out, what our risk categories are, how we look at risk, how we categorize risk, the governance behind our risk program, and some of our risk management policies.
Well, I'm Paul Hughes from Southern Company, and thanks, Jeff, and the invite here. It's been great to kind of sit and listen. The conversations have been fantastic. So Southern Company being a vertically integrated IOU, our perspective may be a little bit different. And you can see, as we've seen our industry change a lot, Southern Company has changed a lot, even within the last 3 to 5 years. So you can see a couple of items on the slide. You see our footprint looks a little bit larger than maybe it did a few years ago, but we still are, around 44,000 megawatts. The traditional footprint in the southeast, in that area that was discussed, in that hole that was discussed in the previous conference, is still where most of our regulated entities are centered. But we're now almost 50% gas. We purchased the old Atlanta gas lighter, AGL Resources, several years ago. That's changed our look. We have a Southern Power unregulated entity that is in several of the MISO, several of the organized markets. And then we have some smaller entities, Power Secure, which works with a lot of distributed generation, as well as some gas trading operations. So you can see we've kind of spread out. So we've got electric utilities, we've got our wholesale electric utilities, which would be our Southern Power. You see our natural gas. Some of y'all may be familiar with a few of those as we get up, and we're no longer just in the south. And then the other solutions is more along the Power Secure, Southern Nuclear, and some of those entities. In terms of risk management structure, I don't necessarily have a slide, except I would tell you that the amount of change we've had, our structure has gotten much broader. So it's more of a pyramid type structure, if you will, and we have functional risk control areas now spread out through the organization that work their way up through an enterprise risk management function. And then the chief financial officer also serves as our chief risk officer these days.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and it's great to be here with you. Thanks, ACES, for the opportunity to be up here with these individuals. I'm going to hopefully share some perspectives from a technology background with GE and being a CEO of a couple distribution cooperatives, one in a G&T, one not in a G&T, both of which affiliated with organized markets to some degree. And then also the last 4 years, some perspectives from being at CFC. I understand that this is probably not necessary and for most of the people in this room, but recognizing that we've got some guests here, a very quick overview of CFC. Very unique financial services organization, nonprofit, sole purpose of being in existence is to provide low-cost capital to our member owners and help you all be successful as much as we can be. Sole purpose organization. Created 1969. This is our 50th anniversary. April, believe it or not, of 1969, at an NRECA annual meeting, there was a resolution that passed authorizing the creation of a financial services organization owned by the electric cooperatives. And about 2 weeks later, CFC was incorporated. Our papers were filed. So 50-year anniversary, big milestone for us. Governed by a 23-member board. These are all CEOs and directors of distribution and co-ops, as well as we have the president and vice president of the NRECA board, as well as a financial expert, which meets the requirements of Sarbanes-Oxley. So quick overview, we're just about to finish our fiscal year, and actually tomorrow, May 31st, and we're going to finish the year with about $27 billion worth of assets. We're a frequent issuer on Wall Street, and so instead of talking about CFC's enterprise risk management practice, which is not totally relevant to this audience, I thought it might be more advantageous to just spend a minute talking about the perspectives from Wall Street as it relates to our industry. And what I mean Wall Street, I'm talking about the rating agencies. CFC is rated by Fitch, S&P, and Moody's, as well as what we're hearing from the investors. And we're going to talk more about this a little later in the session. But it's kind of interesting. We're here talking about risks and what's changing in our environment. But frankly, from Wall Street's perspective, things are pretty good right now for the electric utility industry. We've been in a period of low interest rates. We've got great access to capital. Our fuel costs are down. The regulatory environment has been fairly favorable. And Fitch uses this term of electricity affordability, which means that the household wages are keeping up with, are exceeding the rate at which we're seeing electric rates go up. So all of that creates a pretty favorable environment for the utility industry, along with 10 years of sustained economic growth. And then on the uncertainty side, which is what they're bringing up, we're going to talk about these things over the next hour. But basically, it's the things that just Jeff highlighted, is uncertainty relative to the future of the business model, headline risk, ESG awareness, which we'll talk about, environmental sustainability and governance issues and concerns, as well as policy shifts and the trend towards a much more decreasing power supply diversity.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start the Q&A by having each of the panelists express what they believe is the top risk facing the industry today. And for that, we're going to start with Paul, next Greg, and then we'll go to Mike.
Well, when I first got out of school, I took a job as an auditor, and I had a managing partner, and he would, you'd go through the work papers and do all your good stuff, and he always would get on to folks if they ever did anything, and if they did anything that he considered Sally. He said, Sally does not work for me. And Sally was same as last year. And so I think for the utility industry, and I would say for us, we have to be very careful. Sally's dead. Same as last year is over. And what that means for us in our system planning process is those guys are struggling. And they're struggling for all the things we've heard about today. How do we go and deploy our capital? Do we still look at the central planning? Do we look at another 40-year life asset? How much renewables do we want to pin? What about DERs? Do we want to have assets that maybe have a 10-year life? What about PPAs? How long are we willing to enter into a PPA? And so all of those things, Southern's a little bit unique. We have our 4 utilities that make up the pool, or our power pool, and 3 of those are regulated. There's a lot of coordination that goes on, but who's going to do what? Every state's a little bit different. Some states are pushing very hard for renewables. Other states are not quite there by any stretch of the imagination. So determining what diversity means going forward, and I think the definition of diversity may be slightly different in our industry today than it was last year. And so I think struggling and dealing with that, to me, is how do we move forward is the biggest challenge and risk we have today.
So your diversity really doesn't come from having to be in 1 or 2 or 3 ISOs. It's more about the states that you're serving.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
About our states that we're serving, as well as our stakeholders, which may mean shareholders. So we have shareholders that are very vocal now and look at large blocks, people on Wall Street, and they want to know, how green are you? Are you green enough? And some folks say no, some folks are okay with that. But that is one piece of the puzzle in that system planning as we move forward. The other piece I didn't mention was we have shifted dramatically from being, a heavy coal utility to now coal is about a third of our resource mix. That's a significant change, but as you go to retire those, and this audience knows, it's difficult. Those are hard decisions. They affect lots of people, and that is one other element that those planners and that system planning is just having to deal with.
Okay, great. Thanks, Paul. Go ahead, Greg.
Okay, boy, there's so many to pick from, but I guess what I would tee up is that, we're in an interesting policy situation where we now have kind of evolved from seeing 38 states that have implemented renewable portfolio standards to now Hawaii and California adopting a 100% carbon-free electricity future. This has been a very active legislative session across the country over the last 4 or 5 months. And now we've got 5 states that have enacted legislation that says that that they want to have 100% of their electricity supply be 100% carbon-free. And oh, by the way, you've got 8 more states that are actively debating it in sessions that are still going on. So you've got kind of a dynamic here of you've got time frames that have been set, some intermediate gates along the way of milestones along the way, and then we've got a number of our predominantly C&I members that are demanding renewables and 100% green power. And oh, by the way, this is not in the same context of traditional thinking about assets over a 30, 40-year period of time, but they want it now. Or they want it an intermediate milestone within 5 years. So I think that's going to be a real challenge for us. How do we adapt from where we are today to an environment where the expectations from a consumer perspective, as well as a legislative and regulatory perspective, is in a very different place?
Well said. Thank you very much. Okay, Mike.
Well, so at the risk of repeating what almost every speaker up on the stage said today, we're facing daunting change. And we've heard about just the changes in renewables. We've heard about changes in policy and regulation. We've left some out. We haven't talked about the aging infrastructure that we're dealing with the workforce that we're dealing with millennials that are both part of our workforce but also part of our membership. Impacts of electric vehicles. There was a little bit of discussion about that, but that's growing. And we heard about the Internet of Things. We didn't really talk about artificial intelligence or cognitive technologies, which are eventually going to have a very profound impact on the way we all do business. So it's easy to see how progressive members, and I'm talking about distribution cooperative members, but I'm also talking about retail members, C&I members, might want to take this pace of change on by attacking it directly and trying to go it alone. And so, my top risk is, you've heard the thread throughout the day, starting with Mike and ending with Michael Brooks, about the cooperative model. And to some extent the G&T model, but I would say even more broadly the cooperative model. I think that, I want to first of all say that the perspective that I'm bringing you today is not just Great River Energy's perspective, but the perspective of a number of risk managers that are part of the G&T ERM committee. So some of you are members of that committee, and I just want to make that clear that this is maybe a broader perspective, and it's more G&T focused rather than widely industry focused. But we're starting to hear things about members talking about buying out. That's becoming commonplace in some instances. And I think that the risk really is that we forget who we are, and we forget why we are here, and we forget about the economies of scale that we get working together, and we forget about the things that we're able to do together and take on these challenges. So I think that what we need to make sure that we do as G&Ts and as distribution cooperatives is make sure that we're able to adjust to this and adapt to these changes, and look at more flexible power purchase agreements, power purchase contracts, and rates. And that's a huge challenge as well. I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit more about.
So Mike, I guess the economies of scale are pretty obvious, but is it also true that the G&T sort of acts as a central provider of market intelligence to the distribution co-ops?
It does very much, and we heard about that this morning with the Founders Panel. There are things that smaller members just can't do on their own, and probably don't want to do on their own, and they can't afford to do it on their own.
Okay,
So,
great. Well, first blush, gentlemen, any of you want to follow up on the top risks mentioned by your other colleagues here before we move on? Any other thoughts?
Well, I'm just going to echo something Mike said, or mention something Mike said. You know, again, I've had the opportunity to work at a very small co-op and a very large, relatively large distribution co-op. It was a real challenge when you're very resource constrained to not be able to do a lot of the things that you need to do in a changing world. And so the dependence and ability to rely on a G&T and all the G&T services that can be provided, it's an opportunity for, I think, a new relationship to kind of evolve between the distribution cooperatives and the G&Ts, one not necessarily just defined by a wholesale power contract or value-added services, but a lot of other things that are evolving pretty quickly in our world.
Okay, great. Well, now that we've identified really the panelists' top risks, let's come back to some of the other risk-driven changes that we're seeing in our industry. And I'll start with decarbonization. So despite the easing at the EPA on the clean power rules, we still see pressures to reduce carbon intensity continue to come from some states, from member systems, from C&I accounts, from other stakeholders, and really from the competition in your region. So, however, you know, as another thought to that, there are also risk-reward trade-offs to kind of being a first mover in that area and getting out ahead of the parade in terms of, you know, greening the portfolio and reducing carbon. On the other hand, there are risks in terms of a weighting strategy and maybe being at the back of the parade on that. So let me ask the panel, what are the risks in lagging behind the competition in voluntary carbon reduction strategies and clean energy progress? Let's start with Greg, next Mike, and then Paul.
Okay. Let me first say that this job at CFC has been interesting in that it gives a small group of us at CFC the opportunity to kind of look across the country and see what's going on regionally. And so one thing that we try to do is we watch the earnings calls, Paul, and listen in on them and try to get what are the general themes going on with the investor-owned utilities on a quarter-to-quarter basis. And it's pretty remarkable for those of you that might be doing this, which I'm sure not too many of you are doing it, but it's amazing how few of them, let me rephrase it, almost every one of them has gone out publicly on these earnings calls and has committed to a certain decarbonization strategy. And in some cases, it's 100%. Frankly, a lot of you all heard Xcel Energy back in December announce their plans to decarbonize their electricity supply. Just since December, though, there's been at least 3 or 4, maybe more, I'm sure there are more that I'm not aware of, investor-owned utilities that have gone ahead and followed suit. And in their integrated resource plan, it's committing to 100% carbon-free. So it's a little kind of interesting. Going back to your question, Jeff, though, is I'm going to talk about it in the context of Wall Street. And I know some of the folks in this room have seen it firsthand, but you know, this ESG phenomena, environmental sustainability and governance concept, which has been around for decades. You know, it started ecology, and then the social aspects of this, you know, had to do with, you know, our kids, underage kids making sneakers in Thailand or something. But more recently, we're starting to see a growing trend in the public capital markets coming to the United States. It's been going on in Europe for a while, but we're starting to see it really kind of take shape in the United States. And what I'm talking about is a much greater interest by investors, folks that are going to buy utility debt, on what's going on and what are those systems doing, what are those utilities doing in the area of ESG. And in this context, it's talking about predominantly climate change or greenhouse gas emissions. There's been a couple situations in the co-op world where it's kind of, we've seen it, but it was really interesting to see in March, there were a number of issuances of long-term debt in the public markets. And there were two investor-owned utilities, both of which were very coal-weighted, actually had to pay a premium for their public debt versus other comparable rated investor-owned utilities that issued right around the same time. And so there was a premium of about 10 to 15 basis points that they paid on long-term debt. Doesn't sound like a lot. But the investor pool was smaller than there were investors that dropped out because of their concentration in coal. So we're starting to see a trend on this. The public markets for capital are still very deep right now. It's a very attractive time to issue debt, but we are starting to see an alarming trend that is coming to the United States first, which showed its head in Europe.
Very interesting. Thanks, Greg. Mike?
Well, so Great River Energy is in Xcel's backyard in Minnesota, and so part of it being a problem for waiting to do things is to end up following them and being more driven by local or state regulation. So Minnesota is a pretty progressive state. There was recently a bill in front of the legislature to move to 100% renewables by 2050. Which is the commitment that Xcel's made, and they openly admit that they don't know how they're going to get to do that last 20 or 10 or 20%. So part of it for us is if we wait too long and regulation comes down, prices go up because the developers know that we have to buy. So we're Great River Energy is getting ahead of that.
Okay. And Paul?
Well, it's funny. When we talked earlier, and Greg, they were telling me about Xcel Energy and their commitment, and I kind of had to chuckle, and I even have a copy of it. This is a little booklet. I know you can't see it, but it says Planning for a Low Carbon Future. And so Southern Company falls in that same bucket that you just talked about, and that we have a low to no carbon goal by 2050. And the baseline for that starts in 2007, and then by 2030, we're supposed to be 50% reduction, and then I'll let y'all define what a low to no carbon actually means. But not to sound repetitive, but the investment community, whether those are institutional investors or activist investors, are stakeholders, and they are making a difference. And some of the products that you have seen overseas, you're starting to see now. I know there's green bonds. One of our subsidiaries participated in a green bond offering. So it is going on, and it is certainly alive and well and happening. And I don't think you can ignore it. I do think you have to manage it, and I alluded to this earlier. For us, and I think probably for y'all as well, we're not in an RTO, so we have a lot of state PSC input on what we do, and our area, the states like that control. They believe very strongly in it. But when you operate a pool that has multiple states in it, and those states have very divergent thoughts on what that generation mix should look like, it makes it for a very fine line that you have to walk, and how you message and how you explain how you want to get from 2007 to 2050. It's a tight wire.
Okay. So that question was centered on being maybe at the back end of the parade. Is there a risk of greening the portfolio too quickly and being out too far in front of the parade? I'll come back to you, Paul, and then we'll go to Greg.
Well, y'all may know we currently are building what a lot of people will say is the last nuclear plant. So we're actually in the process of building Plant Vogtle. But we also have a failed unit where we tried to build Kemper County, which was a humongous project, which was essentially carbon capture coal unit, and that took so long. Quite frankly, the economics changed from the time that the project began to the time we converted to fully gas. Not because the technology didn't work, but the market moved on us. I think there is it's a technology risk. We heard this morning somebody talking about the batteries, right? So we've got these great batteries, battery is awesome. But we also heard, hey, well, that battery's pretty good for 2 to 4 hours, but there's this other one coming down the road that's going to be great for a week or 2 weeks or whatever, in tens of thousands of cycles. So I do think that is a risk, and I think that gets back to, I'm going to say, as you plan forward, how do we value, and I don't think we as an industry do it very well, how do we value optionality? How do we put a value on that? And I've done that in trading organizations in the past, but I'm not sure we've done it really well in a regulated utility environment.
Okay. Greg?
Yeah, I guess two responses to that. One is, is there a risk of being too early? I think if you just look at folks that might have signed PPAs, wind and solar PPAs several years ago, where they thought they were phenomenal prices, and now look at where they are. So that might be one risk, but I'm not sure you're going to get ahead of that curve anytime soon. The other risk is being too early. If you're going to make this commitment, and I'm talking about the messaging to Wall Street is you're making a commitment to kind of decarbonize your system. You're committed, and your credibility is at stake in the markets, and you better make those commitments, or there'll be some consequences of that. So those would be the two things that come to mind.
Okay, great.
Jeff, I just a little bit to add to that.
Mike?
Different than Southern Company. So we're G&Ts, we don't get the benefit of the tax credit. So we're doing a lot of PPAs, right? And these PPAs are 25 years out. If we jump too soon and too deep, we really don't know 25 years, 20 years from now, 15 years from now, what the market dynamics are going to be like.
Yeah.
And so, the whole, is the wind going to, blow too much? Are we going to have congestion? Are we going to have huge reliability issues? So you kind of have to do it gradual.
Yeah, the pace of change sort of makes people a bit shy about going out too far like that. So yeah, that's a great point. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about distributed energy resources because they profoundly alter the usage of the electric grid as utilities are now being asked to accommodate the flow of power in both directions. And this new use of the system results in cost shifting and is problematic for existing rate structures. So this question's for Greg. How can the rates be structured to fairly share the costs between grid customers when all the demand does not flow through the meter?
Yeah, so this is an area that my group at CFC is set up to help co-ops with. We've got a group of about 7 or 8 folks that help folks do rate studies, and this is one of the paradigm shifts in our industry. For decades, we've gotten used to a 2-part rate on the retail side of things. You got a monthly service charge, $10-15 a month, and then you got the variable portion of it, which inevitably is not fully reflective of variable costs, but there's a tremendous amount of fixed costs that are still in your variable rate. And as we've seen distributed generation start occurring and energy efficiency reduce the sales growth in the electric co-op space, it's forced a lack of full revenue recovery necessary to meet your financial objectives. And so very quickly, the industry is shifting from an area of 2-part rates to let's get our monthly service charge jacked up to a point where now we're going to be able to fully recover our fixed costs, or now with 65% of distribution cooperatives that have AMI deployed. Now we can start noodling about how do we put in demand charges at the residential level and start thinking about how do we truly design our rates, retail rates, on a cost of service basis. So that's all well and good. That's one part to your question, Jeff.
right.
But the other part to that question is, if we're just now incentivizing our members, our consumers, to go ahead and install a Tesla Powerwall, and and reduce their demand charges, just like our CNIs are doing in a lot of cases. Most of our CNIs are on demand charges, and so here's the evolution of this. We got to think about, how do we do this? How do we design rates where we're going to be able to make sure we're getting revenue recovery, but we're also doing this in a way that we're not disintermediating our consumer members. And the last point I'll mention is the importance of doing this in conjunction with your G&T. Because obviously distribution cooperatives are going to be passing through power costs, and in the world of distributed energy resources and distributed generation, the time is never more important for G&Ts and distribution cooperatives work on aligning wholesale retail rates, so we're sending the right pricing signals all the way from the G&T down to the consumer, so we don't have distribution cooperatives that put in substation battery systems to reduce their demand charges at the expense of other members.
Good point. So also in the context of distributed energy resources, this is for Paul and Mike. How does a power supply planning process change, since you're not the only planner on the system anymore if you've got distributed resources going in out there? We'll start that with Paul.
I will tell you the same thing I told when we talked about this earlier. I'm not really sure. I think that's maybe perhaps one of the biggest challenges we have. Where we are, we have, and I think there's a lot of members in this room can relate to this. We've got a lot of these energy resources coming down really rapidly in cost on the energy side. We've got the transmission cost maybe increasing as part of that. We have seen through some of our work, we've seen some commercial and industrial customers go ahead and take stuff off the grid, except for having, for some backup capability in case their DER's not there. We've seen the reverse. They put something in place in case something happens on the grid. Who's going to pay for it is a great question. 42% of our customer base makes $42,000 a year per household, and I don't think we're unique in that in this room. But somebody's going to have to pay for it, and I think we have to be very careful how we move forward so that we don't place the burden in the wrong spot, or we don't take on a burden that, quite frankly, we shouldn't be taking on.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that, Mike?
Yeah, so we talked about this earlier, and you have some advantage in that you get to see the stuff coming on. You don't always get to choose whether or not it comes on.
That's right.
G&Ts don't always get to even see it coming on, and so distribution cooperative members, not all members, but some members have a proprietariness around sharing information from their members. What we're doing is working more closely with our 28 members to aggregate and learn more about DER that's going on in the system. So that's helping us. We're fortunate, maybe a little bit more fortunate, in that we're not quite as CNI heavy. So we're just talking about what the distribution cooperative is, the batteries they're putting in their subs, which we learn about and are limited to our 5% self-supply. But it's their members that are putting solar panels out and that type of thing. So far it hasn't been a really big problem, and you wouldn't think that it would be a problem, especially in a state like Minnesota, but we're pretty progressive on solar.
I would add one other thing. I agree completely. I think the transparency and the knowing what is there is huge. As we see solar, it is a growing, particularly in Georgia for us, it is rapidly growing. And so we've gone even to the point of creating a desk on our trading floor, not necessarily to trade around, but just to kind of watch and manage and try to learn from the data we get, how are we going to integrate this thing? Because we recognize it is coming and it's coming quickly, and you can't wait. We have to figure it out.
And where does that, I guess, come from for you? Is that coming from the state, or is that coming from consumers?
So Georgia's a little bit unique. So Georgia is the PSC has very much been pro-solar. In fact, Georgia's got the largest voluntary solar program in the country. But those are individual projects that come online that there'll be RFPs for. So usually in the PSC process or the IRP tenure, the IRP planning, they will set forth targets for every year. And so we'll see I think we're going to see another 1,000 megawatts probably within another year just in Georgia Solar alone. I think that number's right. Don't hold me to it, but It's happening fast.
Gotcha. Okay. One of the things that hasn't been talked a lot about today is reliability. And so in the push for clean energy, we feel like reliability is largely taken for granted, especially in the short run, and perhaps it will become a bigger issue in the long run. The constant balance of electric grid inertia is designed to be sustained by baseload resources, not by intermittent supply like wind and solar. And variable energy resources can also stress a transmission system that was designed for central dispatch. So for the panel, and this first question is for you, Paul, not an easy question, and I guess it's a multi-part question, is what is the cost of reliability? Who will do it? Who wants it? And who will pay for it in the long run?
Yeah, this is another great one. I think where the answer is just I don't know what the cost is. I wish we all did. I mean, it's certainly there, but I don't think it's one that we've. I think as an industry we do a great job. I think people have the expectation when they flip the switch, the lights are always on, right? There is no. The only time they call us is when something doesn't work, right? So it's the customer service. I don't think we have, as an industry, and not intentionally, but I don't think we've done a good job educating our customers on sometimes how hard what we do is. And I think that we're going to have to do some education as we start talking about that cost burden. And it's going to be educating politicians who are sometimes harder to educate in this general public. It's going to be educating policymakers. It's going to be working together cooperatively with our neighbors to do it. When you start talking about the grid and transmission, and as y'all know, it's so interconnected. And what our neighbor does affects us. So I don't have a great answer of how much it is, but I do know it's a problem we're going to have to solve because we can't put it off forever. And whether that is changing our rate structure with our customers, so that we have something that has more of a demand charge and smaller of a variable charge, or if there's some other structure. But those, I think the attempts that have been made so far, I'm not sure how successful those have been, but I think there are a few utilities out there who have tried that. But something's going to have to give.
All right. So this one's for Greg, I guess, thinking ahead a little bit. What are the services and products that will be required moving forward, and how do we present those providers of reliability services and products?
Well, another good question, Jeff. If you just you talked about over the last 5 years, from a nationwide perspective, we've seen coal go from 55% down to where it's projected to be pushing 20% by 2030. Renewables, of course, and natural gas picking up the difference. I think renewables made up 17%, 18% of the gigawatt hours generated in the United States last year. That's projected to be pushing 30% by 2030. So when you think about almost 30% of the nation's power supply coming from renewable variable resources, and you could shave 8% out of that for hydro. So that's heavy metal. That's big spinning mass. but you've got a lot of wind and solar that is inverter-based that is not delivering the same kind of grid inertia that a large shaft is doing and spinning at 3,600 RPM. So, you've got obviously a future need, and this is not just Greg Starheim saying this, but I think many of the RTOs are now starting to talk about this as well. ERCOT, not just talking about potentially considering a new ancillary service and inertia, but also huge variations in variable supply and resources is going to prompt extremely fast-acting type of resources. Perhaps maybe that's going to be taken up by batteries. Maybe it's going to be taken up by fast-acting recips and CTs. But an awful lot of focus is being put on batteries. This is a pretty immature technology, and there's not more than a few years of data out there in our industry for large utility-scale batteries. So, yeah, I'm not sure we really know how this technology is going to work 10 years from now, 15 years from now. And as we're making big investments, I think that's something that is worth considering. NextEra would probably agree, since they're going to be owning these assets under these PPAs, but it's a concern. So I go back is you've got some things that are developing relative to power supply, but you've got some of the ancillary services that there's going to be new requirements for new types of ancillary services in the future that we need to figure out.
Okay, very good. Last July, the Department of Homeland Security reported that Russia's military intelligence agency had infiltrated the control rooms of power plants across the United States over the previous year. And in theory, that could enable it to take control of parts of the grid by remote control. So I'll start with Greg here. Does the grid rely so much on connected technologies that a widespread outage could not be prevented in a mass cyber attack? What are your thoughts in terms of cybersecurity, Greg?
Well, I guess I'm not going to answer your question directly about mass cyber attack and what the implications might be, but yeah, I mean, this is a huge concern. And coming from a relatively small distribution cooperative that did not have an IT professional on staff, I can tell you, this is, and if you look at the median distribution cooperative in the United States of 16,000 meters, and probably, I haven't looked at the data, but probably represents about 40 employees, 40 to 50 employees, most of them line staff. You're going to be capacity constrained, resource constrained relative to being able to contract or source the necessary IT resources to really protect yourself in this new world. And so it's a big concern. And I think the G&Ts certainly are focused on transmission infrastructure and critical infrastructure under NERC standards. The distribution community is not. The regulators haven't really decided how to take action on this, if they are going to take action on this. But I think there's concern within NARUC, the National North America Regulatory Utility Commission, on what type of oversight should distribution utilities have in this space. And I go back, I think it's incumbent upon the national organizations like NRECA and NISC and SCDC and CFC, and we're all working together on this. And NRECA has done a great job with their RC3 program to increase awareness of this. But at the end of the day, when people go back to their co-ops and they've got limited resources just to keep the lights on and keep the bills paid, I think we have a longer-term solution than that, and it's going to be a challenge for us.
Yeah, and we know that Russia targeted Ukraine's distribution system one time, in addition to trying to tap into our own. So it's definitely a concern at the distribution level as well. Question for Mike. Since you have a compliance role, obviously, let me ask you about grid operations personnel. Do you feel that they're well enough trained to determine and detect if a cyber attack is being executed, and if so, then do they know how to respond properly?
So I'm going to say that no, they wouldn't be able to detect necessarily if a cyber attack was going on. In Ukraine, it was interesting. The operators saw their machines being taken over and actually started videoing it on their phones. And I think part of that was to show that they weren't the ones that did it. But they weren't able to do anything to stop it. There's a virus called Stuxnet that you've probably all heard of at some point in the past. It's a man-in-the-middle virus, and what it means is that it sits between the operator and the control system and tells the operator everything's fine, but meanwhile is messing up the control system. It's what they used, somebody, I think it was the Israeli intelligence agency, maybe the U.S., did that with the Iranian centrifuges. So the operators are sitting there, and the centrifuges look like they're just fine. Meanwhile, they were spinning out of control. So no, I don't think it's possible necessarily that they would see it. One way around that is what you call out-of-band monitoring, right? So that what's actually going on in the field is being monitored separately than the control system that's controlling it. And I think we're probably going to end up seeing more of that.
Okay, great.
And I think just back to Greg's comments, I just wanted to kind of throw in a pitch for the G&Ts, helping out the distribution members with their IT needs from a system operations perspective.
Okay. One other question in that realm, Mike, also, in light of the Russian infiltration, do you feel that NERC's SIP security controls are adequate to detect and prevent a cyber attack?
Is Michael Brooks still in the audience? No, I don't believe that. Compliance is not security. Part of it is whether or not you're a target. So if you're a target, they're probably going to get in. I think the thing that's really important is to be prepared. When you talk about, do the operators know what to do? They might not know what to do immediately when the attack is occurring to shut it down. Like in Ukraine, they had no idea what to do except pull the plug. But to be prepared for a cyber attack, whether it's simply something that shuts down your operations system, NERC has a requirement now that you have a backup system. Well, if your backup system is hot and it's connected, it might also go down. So do you have a plan to run the grid while you're recovering your systems? The maybe bigger, scarier risk is if they're using your systems to create damage, like they did with the centrifuges.
Yeah, good point. We've gotten through most of our questions that have to do with some of the real unprecedented changes. Just got a couple more general questions to open it up for any thoughts there. Let me ask you, we talked about this fast pace of change in our industry, and is that a risk for market participants, I guess, in this brave new world, just the actual acceleration in pace of change? Go ahead and we'll start with Greg, then Mike, then Paul.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting. Dennis Pednerney from Fitch, some of you probably know him. A couple of us were with him a couple weeks ago, and he was actually, Fitch described the next 10 years of our industry is going to be the most tumultuous in history. That's out of his mouth, which was pretty alarming to hear that. He also went on, and I really respect this comment, and I believe in it, is that the electric co-ops, most of us being unregulated, can act in a way, and this kind of started out the day this morning, in a way that can get things done quickly, can get things done collaboratively. We've got a network that we've built through the distribution, G&Ts, national organizations. We got a lot of support, and NERCO, others, to do things that we need to do and to be agile and flexible and fast acting to adapt to a new world, but we need to do that. So that's, I would say, we're in a good place relative to our business model for that.
Okay. Any additional comments, gentlemen?
But I would agree with Michael Brooks' perspective on this is an opportunity, and I don't know if I sounded a little bit down on the members wanting to leave earlier, but I don't think that's the general feel, and I think that we faced larger challenges before. The speed and just impact of all this change is daunting, but I think we're all up for it.
I think I would say, and I think I can say, there's a lot of people in the crowd, I think I can say with confidence that nobody rented a movie from Blockbuster this weekend. Right? And Blockbuster's not around because they were locked. They had an opportunity to follow the Netflix model. They had an opportunity, but they were locked in to marginal cost and using some old models to determine what was worth on something, if they wanted to try something new. Netflix was not bound by any old metrics. They weren't bound by marginal cost. They were starting at the very beginning. And so I want to be Netflix. I don't want to be Blockbuster. Right? And so the reason I say that is we've had this monopolistic mindset being a utility. I think that those days are over, and that they're going, if they're not over, they're fading quickly, because I think the competition on how you make electricity, how you move electricity, and how you sell electricity is changing rapidly. And I think you have to be able, I think we got to be careful that we don't try to drive forward by looking in the rearview mirror, as we heard earlier. And I think we have to be willing to put on the table that our business model may look different. And I think we have to have the courage to adopt that. And it's hard, but I want to be Netflix. I don't want to be Blockbuster.
Well said. Thank you, gentlemen. So we have a few minutes left, and now we'd like to take some audience questions. There are microphone runners around the room, so just raise your hand if you would like to ask a question, and they'll bring you a microphone. And we can't see very well, so we'll take whoever's first. Any questions? All right, I think we've got it. All right, thank you very much.